The unwarranted stop. The late afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the empty stretch of road. Kira Mason, founder of Mason Cybersecurity Solutions, was enjoying a rare moment of peace after a busy day of back-to-back meetings and code reviews. As she steered her sleek Tesla Model 3 around a gentle curve, she couldn't help but appreciate how perfectly everything about the car aligned with her life. It was more than just a vehicle. It was a reflection of her success and the countless hours of hard work she had poured into building her startup. From the smooth, seamless lines of the car's design to the advanced technology integrated into its system, the Tesla was a high-tech marvel, just like Kira herself. Her fingers drummed lightly on the leather steering wheel as she hummed along to the quiet melody of F-Drive, a soothing instrumental piece playing through the premium sound system. It was exactly the kind of music she needed after a day filled with intense work. The rhythmic beats of the song had a calming effect on her, helping her unwind and clear her mind. But as Kira drove through the winding roads just outside the city, the serenity of the moment was suddenly shattered. A flash of red and blue lights flickered in her rearview mirror, accompanied by the loud and insistent sound of a siren. Kira's heart skipped a beat, her thoughts immediately racing. She glanced at her speedometer, which indicated she wasn't speeding. Her calm demeanor didn't falter, even as she instinctively eased the car over to the shoulder of the road. Through her side mirror, she watched a tall, uniformed figure emerge from the police cruiser. His movements were deliberate, the sound of his boots striking the asphalt creating an air of authority. The officer's posture was rigid, his expression unreadable, and Kira couldn't shake the sense that this wasn't just a routine traffic stop. She had been pulled over many times before, and she knew the drill: hand over the documents, answer a few questions, and drive off. But something about this moment felt different. The officer approached her window with a slow, measured pace, his hand resting casually on his belt. His face was set in hard lines, and the look in his eyes seemed almost suspicious. He stopped just short of the window, his gaze scanning the interior of the car. Kira could tell that he was sizing her up, but she refused to let the unease creep into her voice. "License and registration," the officer demanded, his tone flat and businesslike. Before Kira could even lower her window completely, he had already started speaking. His voice had an edge to it, as if he was looking for trouble. "Of course, officer," Kira replied, her voice steady, though a small hint of confusion crept into her words. "May I ask why I've been pulled over?" The officer didn't answer her question. Instead, he grabbed the papers from her with a barely noticeable glance at her face, his flashlight sweeping over the interior of her car. It lingered on her laptop bag, sitting on the passenger seat, and the various tech gadgets mounted on her dashboard. The officer's eyes narrowed, and his lip curled slightly as he inspected every detail. "That's quite a setup you've got here," he remarked, his voice carrying a trace of suspicion. "Lot of expensive equipment." He made no effort to hide the judgment in his tone. Kira sat up a little straighter in her seat, her professional instincts kicking in. "Yes, I run a technology company," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Everything here is standard business equipment." The officer's eyebrows lifted slightly, his skepticism clear. "A technology company." His tone suggested that he didn't believe a word of it. "And you can afford a car like this." Kira felt her cheeks flush, but she fought to keep her composure. "Yes, I'm the founder and CEO of Mason Cybersecurity Solutions," she said, the words coming easily. "We work with several major corporations in the area." The officer's flashlight beam swept over the car again, but this time it lingered longer. He studied the Tesla, his gaze moving from the dashboard to the pristine seats, the gleaming steering wheel, and the cutting-edge touchscreen console. Kira could feel his mistrust growing, the air between them thickening with tension. "I see," the officer finally muttered, but his voice lacked the warmth of belief. "Stay in the vehicle," he ordered curtly before turning and walking back to his cruiser. Kira felt a knot of unease begin to form in her stomach as she watched him retreat. The car's systems were still humming quietly, but her peaceful drive had now been interrupted by the officer's intrusive presence. She could feel the tension building inside her, but she knew better than to react. She was used to being the subject of suspicion, being the successful black woman in a tech industry still dominated by men, let alone in a car like this, meant that she had often faced questioning that others never had to endure. But every time it happened, it still stung. Minutes passed in silence as the officer remained in his cruiser, speaking into his radio. Kira couldn't make out the conversation, but she knew it had something to do with her. After what felt like an eternity, the officer returned to her window, his expression unchanged. "Step out of the vehicle, please," he commanded, his voice cold. Kira's stomach tightened, but she remained calm. "Officer Hayes," she said, reading his nameplate, "I still don't understand why I was pulled over. Have I done something wrong?" The officer didn't answer. His posture remained rigid, and he stood there for a moment, seemingly weighing his next words. Finally, he spoke again. "Let's just say I had a hunch," he said vaguely, his voice carrying a note of finality. He made a slow, deliberate motion toward the car door, as if giving her no choice but to comply. A wave of disbelief washed over Kira. She hadn't done anything wrong. She had followed the law, provided all the necessary documentation, and even offered to verify everything. But this officer, this complete stranger, was going to take her car based on nothing more than a hunch. The unfairness of it hit her like a cold gust of wind, and for the first time in years, she felt a flush of frustration and helplessness. "Ma'am," the officer repeated, more sternly this time, "step out of the vehicle." Kira's heart began to race. As much as she wanted to challenge him, she knew it was futile. She opened the door and stepped out of the car. The gravel crunched beneath her feet as she stood by the shoulder of the road, trying to steady her breathing. The officer circled her car slowly, inspecting it like some kind of suspicious contraband. His flashlight beam flicked over every inch of the sleek exterior, scrutinizing the bodywork as if it was somehow guilty of being too clean, too perfect. "Is there something specific you're looking for?" Kira asked, trying to keep the frustration from seeping into her voice. "Just doing my job, Mom," the officer replied flatly, his eyes scanning the car with renewed suspicion. "Stay where you are." Kira stood there, helpless, her gaze flickering from the officer to the luxury vehicle she had worked so hard to afford. She had invested blood, sweat, and tears into creating a business that was built on innovation and excellence. And yet here she was, being treated like a criminal for simply being successful. The injustice of it all was almost unbearable. She took a deep breath and pulled out her phone. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened the digital files that could prove she was the rightful owner. She had purchase agreements, insurance documents, even photos from the day she bought the car, all neatly stored in her phone. "I have additional documentation here," she said, her voice a little shaky. "Digital copies of my purchase agreement, insurance." Before she could finish, the officer raised his hand dismissively, cutting her off. "Put the phone away, ma'am," he said, his voice cold and firm. "I don't need to see any more paperwork." Kira was stunned. "But this proves everything. The car is legally mine." The officer didn't respond. Instead, he turned toward the driver's side of the Tesla, walking briskly toward the door. Kira's eyes followed him in disbelief. "Wait," she called out, her voice rising in panic. "How am I supposed to get home? We're miles from anywhere." But the officer was already sliding into the driver's seat of her Tesla, adjusting it to accommodate his larger frame. With a quiet hum, the car's electric engine came to life, and the officer pulled away without another word, leaving Kira standing on the side of the road, her heart sinking as she watched her beloved car disappear into the distance. She stood there, motionless, the fading red taillights of the Tesla the only sign that it had ever existed in that moment. The officer's cruiser followed, vanishing around a bend as the dust settled around her. She was alone. Tears of frustration and disbelief stung her eyes, But Kira refused to let them fall. Instead, she clenched her fists at her sides and watched the empty road before her. She wasn't just going to let this go. This wasn't just a simple case of a stolen car. This was something much bigger, something that Kira knew she had the power to change. The encounter that changed everything. Kira Mason stood frozen on the shoulder of the road, her chest rising and falling as the distant sound of her stolen Tesla's tires rolling over the highway slowly faded into nothing. The shock of the moment had not yet worn off, and she felt a strange stillness in the air around her, as if the world had paused for just a beat. The vast emptiness of the road stretched endlessly before her, the sun sinking lower, painting the sky in hues of purple and orange. But none of it mattered now. Her car, her prized possession, was gone. And worse, it had been taken by someone who had no right to do so. The gravel crunched beneath her boots as she took a hesitant step forward, glancing down the road where the red taillights of the police cruiser had disappeared moments earlier. She could hardly believe what had just transpired. 1 minute, she had been humming along, enjoying the smooth hum of her Tesla, a car that not only represented years of hard work and success, but also embodied the cutting-edge technology she had developed as a cybersecurity entrepreneur. And now, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. Stolen, not by a criminal or a thief, but by Officer Walter Hayes, a cop who had stopped her for reasons she still couldn't understand. Her pulse quickened as the anger began to take hold. She had tried to stay calm, tried to follow the rules, to cooperate. Yet none of it had mattered. Hayes had made up his mind the moment he saw her, profiling her based on nothing but the color of her skin and the car she was driving. It wasn't just any car. It was a luxury vehicle, a symbol of her success, and to Hayes, it seemed to be a glaring target for his unchecked prejudices. How could he have just taken it? Kira thought, her hands clenching into fists. How could he assume that I didn't deserve it, or that I somehow wasn't supposed to be here, driving this car? The injustice of it all made her stomach churn. She was no stranger to racial profiling, having faced it many times in her life. But this was something different. This was not just about being a black woman in a world that often doubted her place in it. This was about being a woman who had worked tirelessly to build something that was hers, only to have it ripped away by a man who had no idea who she truly was. A man who believed his authority could trump her rights at the mere sight of her success. Kira's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She couldn't believe she had allowed herself to be so vulnerable. This wasn't just about the car. It was about the principle, the audacity of someone like Hayes thinking he could take what belonged to her. It wasn't just about what he had done, but what it represented. His actions symbolized everything that was wrong with a system that constantly held people like her back, questioned their worth, and ignored their humanity. She exhaled sharply, trying to steady herself. This wasn't the time to succumb to anger. She couldn't afford to lose herself in the fury of the moment. She had to think. The first thing she needed to do was to get home. But the second thing, the most important thing, was that she had to make sure Hayes paid for what he had done. Not just for taking her car, but for everything he represented. She would not let this slide. He had messed with the wrong woman. Kira reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen, but she didn't make the call right away. Instead, she paused for a moment, considering the situation. It was already bad enough that she had been targeted by an officer who was supposed to serve and protect. What could she do now? Could she take action? Could she actually get her car back, or would she be forced to deal with the bureaucracy of the police department? As much as she hated to admit it, the latter option seemed more likely. She dialed her best friend, Natalie, a seasoned attorney who was used to dealing with cases involving police misconduct. It didn't take long for Natalie to pick up. "Kira, what's going on? You sound out of breath. Where are you?" I just got pulled over," Kira began, her voice shaking despite her best efforts to remain calm. "He took my car. Nat. The officer. He just took it. No reason. He didn't even tell me why." He didn't care to listen when I explained. He just took it. A pause on the other end. Kira could almost hear the gears turning in Natalie's head. Wait. Are you serious? He took your car. No, that's not right. Okay, listen to me. First, where are you? I'll get someone over there right away. Second, are you sure you're okay? This doesn't sound good, Kira. I'm okay, Kira replied quickly, her voice steady now. I need to think about how I'm going to handle this. I need to get the car back, but I don't know how I'm supposed to do that. I need to talk to someone who can help. You don't get it, do you? Kira said, her eyes narrowing as she took in his trembling form. This isn't just about revenge, Hayes. This isn't even about the damned car. This is about everything you've taken. Every time you thought you could walk all over people like me. You've pushed too far, and now there are no more chances. No more favors. No more lies. She could see the flicker of fear in his eyes, and for the first time, it felt satisfying. Hayes had always been the one who held the power, the one who could control outcomes with his badge, his connections, and his ability to manipulate the system. But now, that power was slipping away, falling through his fingers like sand. The reality of the situation was sinking in. Kira wasn't just some powerless victim anymore. She had become a force to be reckoned with. Behind her, the Tesla's lights blinked twice, a subtle reminder that everything was aligned. The car's AI had already activated the lockdown feature, disengaging any systems that could potentially be tampered with. Hayes couldn't even drive off if he tried. The police cruiser, which had once been an instrument of power in his hands, was now just another liability. Every minute that ticked by, his chances of escaping without consequences were slipping away. Kira's finger tightened slightly on the trigger, just enough to make Hayes aware of the finality that loomed over him. I'm not asking you to understand. I'm not asking you to forgive yourself. But you will pay for what you've done, Hayes, and you will never get another chance to hurt anyone again. The air seemed to hum with the weight of her words. Hayes blinked rapidly, his gaze darting around for a way out, but there was nowhere to run. He could hear the faint sound of sirens in the distance, but even they felt irrelevant now. This wasn't a situation where the law could save him. Not anymore. Please, he said again, the word coming out softer this time. His shoulders slumped in defeat, the fight draining out of him. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I got caught up. It wasn't supposed to go this far. Kira's eyes softened, just slightly, but it was enough to remind her that she wasn't a heartless monster. She wasn't doing this out of malice, but out of necessity. He had made his choices, just as she had made hers. He had crossed a line, and now there were consequences to face. You should have thought about that before, Kira replied, her voice devoid of emotion. You should have thought about it when you were taking everything from me. You should have thought about it when you decided to crush people beneath your boot. There was a long, pregnant silence. Hayes took a shallow breath, his eyes flickering with something that bordered on resignation, something that hinted at an understanding that perhaps, deep down, he had always known this day would come. Finally, Kira gave a slight nod, signaling that this moment was over. Hayes had no more cards to play, no more excuses to make. He was done. Kira turned her attention back to the Tesla, her thumb brushing against the lock button one final time. The car's systems hummed again, the satisfying sound of its AI coming to life, as if acknowledging her victory. Get out of here, Hayes, she said, her voice unwavering. You're free to go. But remember this. You don't get to decide who walks away. Not anymore. You don't control this game anymore. I do. And with that, Hayes slumped back into his seat, his fight officially over. As Kira stepped back, she felt the rush of relief and triumph flood through her. The nightmare was finally over. But the battle had taken its toll, emotionally, mentally, and physically. Yet, Kira knew that she had changed. The woman who stood in front of Hayes wasn't the same one who had started this journey. Kira had reclaimed everything. Her power, her peace, and her freedom. As she turned and walked away, the hum of the Tesla echoing behind her, she allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of the world lift off her shoulders. The game was hers now. And for Hayes, well, he'd just have to learn how to play by her rules from now on. The consequences. The echoes of Kira's victory reverberated in her chest long after the confrontation with Hayes had ended. The weight of the gun in her hand had been replaced by an unsettling stillness, a silence that felt both empowering and hollow. She had made her choice. She had done what was necessary. But the reality of it was beginning to settle in. Her heart raced not from fear, but from the sheer magnitude of what she had done. It was one thing to fight the system from the outside, but it was another entirely to bring that system to its knees. This was the most dangerous part of her plan. The auto-return feature was designed for emergency situations, a fail-safe for Tesla drivers who were in danger and needed to get to safety quickly. It was never intended for use against law enforcement officers, and activating it could potentially put her at odds with the very laws she had spent years trying to help protect. But Kira had no illusions about the system anymore. Hayes wasn't just a cop. He was a man who had proven he had no regard for her rights, her safety, or her dignity. She could not let this slide. Kira closed her eyes for a moment, gathering her thoughts. This had to be done carefully. If she triggered the auto-return now, the car would start driving itself back to her location, weaving through traffic in order to avoid obstacles and maximize speed. It wasn't a perfect system. Tesla's autonomous driving tech was still evolving, but it was far enough along to get the car back to her with minimal risk. Her finger hovered over the final button, and she took a deep breath before pressing it. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, the app flashed a confirmation message. Auto-return activated. Kira exhaled, feeling the weight of the decision settle heavily on her shoulders. There was no turning back now. She'd either be able to reclaim her car, or things would escalate in a way she hadn't anticipated. The minutes seemed to stretch on endlessly as she waited, her mind working overtime, running through every possible outcome. Suddenly, the notification on her phone buzzed. The car had begun its autonomous return journey. She quickly opened the live feed of her car's cameras. The streets outside were blurred, but through the grainy footage, Kira could see the Tesla slowing down as it approached an intersection. She held her breath as it swerved around a parked car, weaving effortlessly through the dense traffic. She could see Hayes' silhouette through the tinted windows of the vehicle, his hands gripping the steering wheel. It looked like he hadn't yet realized what was happening. Kira's heart pounded harder as she checked the car's location again. It was heading straight toward her. She could almost feel the pull of gravity, as if the car itself were being drawn back to her. The excitement was intoxicating, but she didn't dare to let her guard down. Not yet. She had to keep moving. She needed to prepare for the next phase of her plan. Hayes had a car, but she had the technology. And now she had the upper hand. With one eye on her phone, Kira began to gather her things. She needed to make sure she was ready when the car arrived. She grabbed her jacket, slung it over her shoulder, and double-checked that her phone was fully charged. Her next steps were critical. If Hayes realized what was happening and decided to retaliate, she needed to be ready to protect herself. She couldn't risk him trying anything drastic. As she paced back and forth, waiting for the inevitable confrontation, Kira thought about the broader implications of what she was doing. This wasn't just a battle for her car. It was a fight against the system that had failed her time and time again. A system that allowed corrupt officers like Hayes to act with impunity, believing they could take whatever they wanted with no consequences. She couldn't let this slide. Not now, not ever. Minutes passed, but the car was getting closer. Kira's phone pinged with an updated location, just a few blocks away. She could hear the hum of the city around her, the sounds of life continuing as usual, oblivious to the tension building in the space between her and the car. Then suddenly, she saw it. The Tesla appeared in the distance, its sleek body gleaming under the streetlights as it made its way down the road, moving with a fluid grace that contrasted sharply with the jarring, jerky movements of Hayes's original driving. Kira's eyes narrowed as she spotted the police cruiser a few cars ahead. Hayes hadn't noticed the car's strange behavior yet. He was still trying to steer it manually, probably thinking it was some kind of malfunction. But when the Tesla swerved smoothly into the lane ahead of him, Hayes's confusion turned to panic. His hands jerked violently at the wheel, trying to correct the steering, but the car wouldn't budge. It was as if the vehicle had a mind of its own. Kira smiled as she watched the unfolding scene from her phone, her thumb brushing against the screen to adjust the vehicle's speed. Hayes was already trying to call for backup, but Kira wasn't about to let that happen. The Tesla's systems had already executed its calculated maneuver, locking in its trajectory toward her. Now, with the car less than a block away, Kira had one final move to make. It was time to confront Officer Hayes face to face. The confrontation. Kira stood in the middle of the quiet street, the hum of the city's nightlife buzzing in the background, almost entirely unaware of the drama unfolding just a few steps away. Her heart thudded against her chest, the adrenaline sharpening her focus, narrowing everything down to a singular moment. The Tesla was only a few feet away, its polished exterior gleaming in the dim light of the street lamps as it smoothly approached. Hayes had no idea what was coming. For the first time in what felt like forever, Kira felt in control. She was no longer a victim of a corrupted system, nor was she someone merely fighting for a car. She was reclaiming her life, her agency, and her future. As the car slowed to a halt in front of her, she felt a sudden surge of power. She hadn't just used technology to win. She had outsmarted a man who thought he could take anything from her. He wasn't going to get away with it. Her eyes remained locked on the Tesla, watching as Hayes's police cruiser lurched to a stop several car lengths behind it. She could see him in the driver's seat now, fidgeting with the controls, his face contorted in disbelief. Kira had already anticipated his reaction. No one ever expected a car to be smarter than they were. No one ever thought that a vehicle, especially one designed to drive itself, could be the instrument of their own undoing. Kira's phone buzzed again, and she quickly glanced down. The Tesla was locked, its powertrain completely disengaged now, just as she had planned. Hayes was trapped. But there was still one more thing to take care of, something more personal, more final than just technology. She wasn't leaving this to chance. Her hand moved instinctively to the waistband of her jacket, where a small, sleek pistol was tucked in its holster. The weight of the firearm against her side was both reassuring and sobering. This wasn't some fantasy of revenge. This was real life. She had to ensure Hayes couldn't walk away from this with any delusions of winning. Kira took a slow, steadying breath before stepping forward. The movement was deliberate, calm, but there was a sense of urgency in her stride. She could feel the tension in the air, the moment before a storm hits. As she closed the distance, she heard Hayes's voice calling out, his words laced with confusion and rising panic. "Hey, what the hell is going on with the car? You hacking it?" Hayes barked, his hands fumbling with his radio, his eyes darting from the Tesla to Kira. "You need to stop. Right now." She didn't break stride, her gaze unwavering. As she approached the driver's side window, she could see Hayes's eyes flicker to the weapon at her side, then quickly away. She was calm, too calm, and that unnerved him. "No," Kira replied coolly, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "I'm not hacking it, Hayes. I'm taking back what you took from me. The car, yes, but also my peace of mind, my life. I'm done running. Done letting people like you think you can just walk all over me." Hayes swallowed hard, his fingers trembling on the steering wheel as he took in the situation. He'd seen a lot of things in his time on the force: dangerous criminals, unstable people, high-speed chases. But this was something else. Kira's calm demeanor was unsettling, like a storm brewing just below the surface. She wasn't acting out of desperation. She was acting out of resolve. I don't know what your problem is," Hayes stammered, trying to muster some semblance of authority. But this isn't how you deal with it. You think you can just mess with me and walk away scot-free. This is a crime, you know. Kira chuckled softly, the sound hollow in the quiet of the street. You really don't get it, do you? This isn't just about the car. This is about you thinking you can take anything you want without consequence. You think because you have a badge, you can do whatever you want, that no one will stop you. Well, I'm stopping you. Hayes gritted his teeth, and for a moment, Kira could see the fear behind his bravado. He knew the game had changed. He wasn't just dealing with a pissed-off civilian anymore. He was dealing with someone who had the power to make his life hell. Someone who had no intention of letting him walk away from this. Listen, Kira, Hayes said, trying to negotiate. His voice had shifted, the cocky arrogance starting to fade into something more cautious. You don't want to do this. I'm not your enemy here. I didn't mean for things to get out of hand. Just give me the car back, and I'll forget this whole thing ever happened. Kira shook her head, her eyes never leaving his. You don't get it, Hayes. I'm not giving you anything. Not anymore. You think I'll just walk away because you ask nicely. After everything you've done. After all the lies. The manipulation. No. There was a tense silence between them. The kind of silence that stretched and tightened, like the calm before the crash of thunder. Then, as if to break it, Hayes pulled his hand from the radio and reached for his gun, his movements slow and deliberate. Kira didn't flinch. She didn't move an inch. I'm not asking you to make this worse, Hayes said, his voice trembling. But you're not leaving here without consequences. Not after what you've done. You're gonna regret this. Kira's lips curled into a slight smile, one that felt almost cruel in its calmness. You think I'm afraid of you. You think I'm afraid of the law or some badge you wear. She stepped back, her hand tightening around the grip of her own gun as she leveled it at him. Her finger didn't even twitch. I've spent too many years watching people like you get away with everything. It ends today. The air between them felt thick with the weight of unspoken history. Kira knew she wasn't just fighting for the car, or even for herself anymore. She was fighting for every woman, every person who had ever been pushed around by the system. She was done being afraid. Hayes' eyes darted to the pistol in her hand. His mouth went dry, his bravado collapsing like a house of cards. Listen, Kira, you don't have to do this, he pleaded. I'll make sure no one ever knows what happened here. Just give me the gun. Kira tilted her head slightly, her gaze piercing into his. No, you've already shown me exactly who you are, Hayes. And I'm done with it. Her voice dropped, cold and controlled. You're done. Before he could say another word, Kira heard a faint hum, the Tesla's autonomous mode. The car had been following her lead, standing guard like a loyal protector. She didn't take her eyes off Hayes, but she could feel the reassuring presence of the vehicle behind her. It was more than just technology. It was an extension of her plan, her vision. The confrontation had reached its peak. Hayes could no longer bluff his way out of this. Kira's power wasn't just in the gun or the car. It was in the knowledge that she had finally broken free from a system that had always been stacked against her. The breaking point. The tension in the air was palpable. Kira's hand remained steady, the cold metal of the gun a silent promise to Hayes that she wasn't going to back down. His gaze flickered between the weapon and her eyes, searching for any sign of doubt, any trace of hesitation. But there was nothing there. Kira was resolute, the final thread of her patience snapping after years of enduring manipulation, corruption, and silence. She had been pushed to the edge countless times, forced to fight battles that weren't hers to begin with, forced to endure a system that had never cared about justice, only power. Hayes was just another face in that system, another cog in the machine. But today, she was the one in control, and Hayes would learn that he wasn't the one who got to decide when this was over. You're not leaving here with anything, Kira repeated, her voice eerily calm despite the danger radiating from the situation. This is over for you, and I'm not going to stand by and let people like you continue to think you can just Take. Hayes opened his mouth to speak, but the words died on his lips. There was something in Kira's presence now, a gravity, an aura that made him reconsider every decision that had brought him to this point. He had underestimated her, that much was clear. But it wasn't just the gun that made him pause. It was the realization that he was facing someone who had nothing left to lose, and that terrified him more than any weapon. His hands trembled on the steering wheel as his mind raced, calculating every possible way he could get out of this situation. But he knew, deep down, that there was no escaping it. Kira was smarter, faster, and more determined than he had anticipated. The car, the damn Tesla, had thrown everything off balance. It had been her ace in the hole, a game changer he couldn't have prepared for. But now, it was clear that this wasn't just about a car. This was a personal reckoning. Please, he finally managed to choke out, his voice cracking under the strain. You don't know what you're doing. He stopped, swallowing hard, his throat dry. He could see the steady hand of Kira's gun, the cold steel that threatened everything he had worked for. His instincts screamed at him to act, but he couldn't move, not with the fear creeping up his spine. Kira stepped forward, closing the distance, her feet light against the pavement. The calmness in her movements was almost unnerving. She could feel the sweat on her palms, but it wasn't fear. No, this was something else entirely. It was focus. She had been here before, in moments of crisis, moments where the only way out was to take control, and she wasn't about to let Hayes dictate the terms. You're gonna need to be smart about this, Natalie said, her voice now firm with that lawyerly calmness Kira had come to rely on over the years. First things first, document everything. You said he didn't even tell you why he pulled you over. That's important. Get a copy of the report, Kira. The dashcam footage, anything you can get your hands on. And don't let them sweep this under the rug. It's time we hold people accountable for their actions. Kira nodded, although she knew Natalie couldn't see her. She would follow her friend's advice. She had to get everything in writing, every detail she could gather to fight back. But there was one thing she knew for sure. She wasn't going to wait around for someone else to right this wrong. She was going to take matters into her own hands. With determination set in her heart, Kira ended the call and turned her gaze to the road again. Her mind was already whirring with ideas. She could use her technical expertise, her knowledge of cybersecurity and cutting-edge technology, to track the car. There had to be a way. If her car was as connected and as sophisticated as she knew it was, then it wasn't just a luxury item. It was a potential tool for her to regain control. And that was when the idea hit her. Her Tesla, with all of its advanced features, was more than just a car. It was a high-tech machine with extensive capabilities. What if she could tap into its systems remotely? What if she could disable it, take control, and track its exact location? Hayes wouldn't even know what hit him. She could have her car back in no time. And by the end of it, he would learn exactly what it meant to mess with Kira Mason. Her fingers flew over the screen of her phone as she accessed the Tesla app, a tool she had used many times before to monitor her car's status. Her heart raced as she opened up the interface. She could already see the status of the car, the battery charge, the location, everything. It was all still intact, the car's systems running smoothly. Hayes was still driving it somewhere. Kira smiled. It was time to teach him a lesson he wouldn't soon forget. Her thumb hovered over the remote control options. She would have to be careful, but she knew exactly what she had to do next. The plan unfolds. Kira's pulse thudded in her ears as she stared at the screen of her phone, her thumb hovering over the remote control options for her Tesla. The car was still moving, still somewhere out there on the road, its location pinging back to her in real time. Hayes had no idea what was coming. She wasn't just going to sit back and let him get away with this. Her mind raced as she considered her options. Her background in cybersecurity was her ace in the hole, a skill set that had served her well in the tech industry. It was ironic, in a way. All those years of studying code, of building complex firewalls and security systems, And here she was, using that very knowledge to track down a police officer who thought he could take what belonged to her. But this wasn't just about reclaiming a car. No, this was about restoring her sense of control, about proving that no one could just take what she'd worked so hard for without consequences. She didn't trust the police, not after everything that had happened. She couldn't rely on them to do the right thing. The idea of waiting around for some bureaucratic process to play out made her stomach turn. No, Kira needed to act, and fast. The longer Hayes drove her car, the more she felt her chances slipping away. Without hesitation, Kira accessed the advanced settings in the Tesla app. She knew the car's GPS systems inside and out. She had designed the very framework that monitored its location. But this time, she wasn't just tracking it. She was taking control. Her fingers moved quickly, tapping into the car's onboard network. She had created security protocols for Tesla before, helping to harden its software against potential hackers. But now she was about to use it for something much more personal. She activated the remote locking feature and watched as the car's system responded almost immediately. The doors locked. The vehicle's powertrain was disabled, putting the car into a temporary limp mode, where it would be unable to accelerate beyond a crawl. If Hayes tried to push it any faster, he'd be met with a wall of resistance. The thought of him realizing that the car was no longer under his control brought a small smile to Kira's lips. But she wasn't done yet. She had one more tool in her arsenal, something she had never used before. A feature embedded deep within the car's software, the auto-return function. Kira stood outside the Tesla for a long moment, the glow of its lights casting long shadows on the darkened pavement. The air was cool, the city around her dimly lit, oblivious to the small revolution that had just taken place in the shadows. No sirens, no police rushing to the scene, just the faint hum of life continuing, indifferent to her actions. It was exactly what she had always feared. She had become a ghost. The moment she pulled the trigger, she severed her ties to a past she could never return to. She had expected this, the solitude, the loneliness, but that didn't make it any easier to bear. She had known this day would come, that the stakes would rise higher than she could handle, but now that it had happened, the consequences felt more tangible than ever. As she walked back to the car, Kira felt a pang of guilt stir inside her, a slight tightening in her chest. Was it guilt for what she had done to Hayes? No, not at all. The guilt was for something much deeper, more troubling. For the people she had become in the process of seeking justice. People who would never understand her fight. People who would see only her final act, without knowing the years of struggle that had led to it. Would they condemn her? Would they see her as a hero, or as a villain? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from Rafe, the one person who had stuck by her through the worst of it. She hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to expect. Rafe knew who she had become, but Kira had always tried to keep him at arm's length, unwilling to let anyone in too close. But now, after everything, maybe it was time to face the consequences of that as well. She pulled the phone from her pocket and unlocked it, reading the message. Rafe, I got eyes on you. You all right? What happened with Hayes? Kira's fingers hovered over the screen. She hadn't replied to Rafe in days, not since she had decided to go off the grid, but his loyalty had never wavered, and for that, she was grateful. She took a breath and typed back. Kira, it's done. Hayes won't hurt anyone again. I took care of it. The reply was almost instantaneous. Rafe, shit. Are you okay? What's next? Kira stared at the screen for a moment, contemplating her answer. What was next? The question that had been haunting her for weeks. The world had changed. She had changed. But how could she go back to the life she had before? It was too late. She had crossed the line, and there was no going back. She had severed her ties to a world that no longer held any answers. She typed back, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed. Kira, I don't know, Raf. I really don't know. The uncertainty hung heavy in the air as she turned to face the street. The night was endless, stretching out before her like a long, dark tunnel with no clear exit. She had always been the one who controlled the narrative, who set the rules. But now, she wasn't sure what the rules were anymore. The sound of a distant car engine echoed in the quiet, and Kira's thoughts were interrupted by a sudden flash of headlights. Her gaze shifted instinctively, and she saw the unmistakable shape of a black SUV making its way toward her. The car slowed as it neared, and Kira's heart rate quickened. She didn't recognize the vehicle, but she didn't need to. In a city like this, a black SUV was never a good sign. She didn't move. Her mind raced as she calculated her next steps. Was this another attempt to tie up loose ends? Had someone else heard about what had happened to Hayes? Or was this the moment the system came crashing down on her, trying to reclaim control before she could fully escape? The SUV came to a stop just a few feet away, and the engine cut. The sound of the door opening reached her ears, and she instinctively reached for her gun again, feeling the cool metal as her hand closed around it. She wasn't about to be caught off guard again. Out of the vehicle stepped a figure, tall and broad-shouldered, with a presence that immediately commanded attention. Kira's grip on the gun tightened, but she didn't raise it. Not yet. The man's face was partially obscured by the shadow of the SUV, but his posture, the way he carried himself, she knew he wasn't just some random stranger. He was too composed, too deliberate. "Don't." The man's voice was low, steady, and rich with authority. "You don't need that." Kira's eyes narrowed, her senses sharpening as she tried to read him. She didn't recognize his voice, but something about it rang familiar, like a memory from a distant place, a voice from the past. "You've made a mess, Kira," the man continued, stepping closer, his shoes clicking on the pavement. "But there's still time to fix it." "Fix it." Kira's voice was sharp, disbelief edging her words. "What do you want from me?" The man stopped a few feet in front of her. "It's not about what I want. It's about what's going to happen now. You've burned your bridges with Hayes, but you've also stirred something much bigger than you realize." Kira's mind raced. "Who the hell are you?" "Let's just say," the man's voice softened slightly, "that I'm someone who's been keeping an eye on you, and someone who can make sure this little moment doesn't ruin everything you've worked for, if you're willing to listen." Kira's heart pounded in her chest. She had seen this before. Another man, another offer, another chance to make things right. But Kira wasn't that person anymore. She wasn't someone who played by anyone else's rules. But there was something about the man's calm demeanor, his knowledge of the situation, that struck a chord within her. It was the same feeling she had felt when she first pulled the trigger on Hayes, the sense of being watched, being maneuvered by forces beyond her control. "Make sure," she echoed. "And what makes you think I need your help?" The man didn't flinch. "Because you're already in deeper than you know. And I don't think you're ready to face what happens next." Kira's grip on the gun loosened, but her eyes remained cold, calculating. She had no intention of trusting anyone, especially not a stranger who seemed to know too much. But in the back of her mind, one thing was clear. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning.